Before we go on and celebrate the virtues and attributes of the fifth ray, the glorious emerald green ray, a few words about hierarchy. In a sense, amongst spiritual circles, disciples and students of all persuasions of the teachings of the ascended masters far and wide across the face of the world, you almost might say that hierarchy is the H word. That, in a sense, it is something to be put in a closet, like a relative who is slightly out of their mind, something to be swept under the rug, shunned or avoided at all costs. This is an astonishing phenomenon. Many years ago, beloved Zarathustra made the observation that the mankind of earth fear fire, but that they should not fear the sacred fire. And so there is this, yes, irrational reaction to the idea of hierarchy. And yet, whether you use that term, hierarchy, or you use the word or the phrase Brotherhood of Light, both are referencing the same organization and the same principle of the interconnected ladder of life and individualized masters, beginning here in the earth element and rising transcendently without any gap or interruption, all the way to the heart of the great central sun. Surely by now you should realize that the ascended masters have no desire to intrude themselves into your life. They not only have they no desire to do so, they will not interfere where not permitted by the authority of your mighty I Am presence in your affairs, only in answer to your direct calls and the crystallized requests through your invocations and your decrees that they should do so. When Saint Germain was the wonder man of Europe, of course, the subject often came round in the courts of the French kings of his longevity and of him possessing the secrets of life. And on one occasion, he was seated next to an elderly aristocratic woman, long past her bloom of youth, if you will. And at a certain point in the conversation, she observed that she would like to maintain eternal youthfulness just as he did. So they bandied this back and forth for a while. And finally, Le Comte de Saint-Germain said to her, "Then you insist that I give you this blessing, this elixir." And that was the litmus test of whether or not, for whatever reasons karmically, this was allowed to go forward. It required the expression of her free will before even that blessing could be given. So she disappeared for a matter of many months from all of society and reappeared later in the full bloom of youth once again, only to become an object of jealousy and ridicule and suspicion, and had to really move away to where her past was no longer known. For us, the object lesson is in that question of the master, then you insist. Despite what has been the reassurance of the masters countless times, and despite the fact that in the Temple of the Presence, the masters have alleviated any responsibility on the part of the anointed representatives to even render advice as to a specific course of action that any student should pursue in their personal lives. Despite that, still there is this aversion to the idea of hierarchy. Last night, beloved Serapis Bey pointed out one example of that, to where there are those who have said within themselves, I don't need to be a part of an organization. I don't need to be integrated even with the assistance of the ascended masters. I will call to my own I am presence and rely 1000% exclusively on my own I am presence and make it on my own. That is a flash of pride, human ego. And one of the things that you should understand if you do aspire to your ascension is that amongst the ascended masters, there are no island identities. No one is a recluse, an ascetic who lives a totally solitary, isolated life in the ascended master octaves. Such is impossible. It just is not part of the reality of that experience. Because as you have been taught over and over again, there is a greater oneness of all individualizations that are one in the allness of the amity of the I am presence, and a greater oneness in the presence. All are truly, truly one. And the time when an individual is actually able to make that shift in consciousness, the preparation for that must go on here in this outer world. So service, divine service, is many times an opportunity for that knocking off of the rough edges of a false sense of autonomy or isolation. It really is born out of the audacity, or what is known in Greek as the tolma, which is this first repudiation of the outer life stream of the authority of their own I am presence to have authority over their lives. So this false subconscious aversion to what is thought to be a distasteful interaction with hierarchy is something that will have to be overcome. One of the things that when we get into the action of the green ray, one of the things that we will be talking about is that there is a blending of the will of the blue plume with the intelligence of the golden plume of the threefold flame, so that there is, in all cases, whenever any activity is to take place, there is behind that activity directing intelligence. Some part of the greater expressions of God are intelligently engaged in whatever action takes place. Not only is it intelligently engaged, but it is also concentrated and focused and directed in the most precise, spiritually scientific fashion to precise goals. So when the initiations of the resurrection and the ascension are going to take place for an individual, unless you were to have sustained life in the body almost interminably, you will not know outwardly most of the alchemy, the spiritual science involved in that transformation. Hence, the service of that circle of masters of various numbers, maybe 12, maybe 24, standing round about the candidate about to experience those initiations. Those masters are not there just for ceremonial purposes. Each one has attained God control and authority over specific currents of light that have to be guided from the electronic body of the individual into the four lower bodies of that individual. And so those masters are there holding the concentrated attention for the necessary action or divine work and service to be performed on the vehicles. We'll be talking about that focus of the attention. Back to the subject of hierarchy. It is nothing really to be feared, if only it be truly understood. For there to be a real-time engagement of the real ascended masters, not psychic imposters, but the real ascended masters of the Brotherhood, such as takes place here at the Temple of the Presence. The ascended masters, the members of the Brotherhood, have to have a certain standard of assurance that what takes place in the ascended master's presence and what use is made of the grace that they transmit to the student body and on into the world, that will be safely shepherded to its intended purpose, and that it be permitted to achieve that purpose. That is the difference between a vanguard ascended master activity and an ascended master activity that is crystallized where it was when it may have been, for a time, a vanguard ascended master activity. But when the ascended masters, it's not that different from what happens with your life stream. Right now, you are the vanguard activity of the incarnation of your mighty I Am presence. Why? Because every single moment your mighty I Am presence is pouring its crystal cord energy into your bodies. So you are the living, breathing embodiment of your own I Am presence. And so long as the purposes of the presence are accomplishing service to its standards, that life continues. When it no longer serves permanent good, remember that standard that was explained a few days ago? When there is no longer much opportunity for permanent good to be achieved, the I Am presence withdraws. The physical body is still there for a while. Even some of the other vehicles may exist for a period of time. The emotional body becomes a shell. Eventually, even the mental body is discarded. So the bodies are still there, but the presence is not. So for there to be a vanguard activity, it means that what goes on in that the Brotherhood expects the Ascended Master way of life to be lived and practiced in an Ascended Master activity. And the members of the Brotherhood ultimately are just as it is the law, cosmic law is the law of their being. And they cannot ultimately contravene cosmic law by indulging the wholesale misapplication of their light, where that is redirected into things that are not the truths of cosmic law. So those of you who listen from afar or come and make your pilgrimages here on a regular basis, you know absolutely that the Saint Germain, the El Moria, the Mahachohan, all of these Ascended Masters are here in their Ascended Master bodies of light, and they are radiating their light. And thus, this is that instrument, that living instrument of the Brotherhood of Light. It is the exception to the rule that it happen so publicly. And there are long epochs of history when mankind are left to their own devices. I know that in this activity and other Ascended Master activities, there are always imps of the outer ego that rises up from various times and places and disagrees with how things are run. And there is the idea that just give me the teachings and let me alone, and I can do better. I can one-up what the activity is doing. That is a syndrome of human nature. Here at the temple, we affectionately call it Aristotling the teachings of the Ascended Masters. It's the Aristotle syndrome. All of the work that was done by Saint Germain as Plato built up a fervor for the love of wisdom. And there was, with Plato, room for God in the equation, deity. There was room for many deities. And at the capstone of all of them, of course, was the presence, the one, and the good. And from that flowed everything else. And I defy anyone to follow the words of his dialogue on the Parmenides if they are looking for a tour de force of the absolute fidelity of the divine mind operating in a level of impersonal law, and call it logic or reason, if you will. It is quite a tour de force. So what happens with human nature is that it must have something to imitate, something to counterfeit. It doesn't actually ever make anything of the whole cloth. It has to co-opt and misappropriate what has been given, and to engage in a game of one-upmanship. So much of the writings of Aristotle or the attitude that permeates his work is he's sitting way up high as a Supreme Court judge with his gavel and his dour coat on, and he's looking down at the poor intellect of Plato, pronouncing where it's right and where it's wrong, and trying to put his own stamp and ownership on what he co-opted from Plato. That is how a whole false and a totally false school based on the human intellect, divorced of divine intuition and the heart flame, diverted so much attention and focus, something that is still going on to this very day. An example of, and that's a very clear example of not respecting the teacher, not fitting oneself into hierarchy. The example of Saint Germain is quite different. He was so humble that he credited his teacher Socrates with the writing and the words of almost all of the original work that Plato did himself. When he came back as Proclus, again, he didn't lay claim to much himself. He looked to Plato and he looked to his immediate teachers and gave glory to them and glory to God. And he strove to have a fidelity to the teaching. So in the Temple of the Presence, recognizing the foibles and the tendencies of human nature to do this, Master El Morya and the other masters that were involved in the writing of our bylaws orchestrated the establishment of the Collegia Serapis. And the purpose of this institution, there are several purposes. Chief amongst them is the purity, the fourth ray purity under the sterling adherence to the principles of cosmic law without deviation, to be preserved and safeguarded in what is taught and what is set forth here at the temple. And not only what is taught, but also what is practiced in the name of the Temple of the Presence. And so that responsibility is taken very, very seriously. And it is almost like being a farmer who has to go out every morning and pluck the weeds out of his vegetable garden, because overnight they have sprouted and are choking out the plants that will bear fruit. This is something that many people who come here to the temple or who think they're coming for the right reasons, they're coming out of a lust for the truths of cosmic law. They want the truth because inside they understand that true knowledge carries with it its attendant power. So they say, let me have the truths, let me have the law, but leave me alone. And furthermore, I will take this teaching and tweak it here and there, because after all, no one is the ultimate authority, and therefore, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that. I will adapt things and hang out a shingle and say, this is mine. This is my restatement of the principles or restatement of the teachings. And that has happened as recently as this very week, where artwork of the teachings presumably were being republished and redistributed with those distortions. Decrees were being republished with those distortions. And the idea was, well, we will transcribe and publish this, and where it is incorrect and where the masters are telling me that it's right this way or it's right that way, I will make those changes on my own and call them my own. We have, as the anointed representatives, a solemn responsibility to preserve, protect, and defend the teachings of the ascended masters, the true teachings, and to safeguard them in that absolute fidelity to the principles of cosmic law. It's very interesting that although this individual had claimed, made that acclamation that they wished to recognize the anointed representatives as speaking on behalf of the ascended masters, no sooner was this request made than there was summarily a resignation from the activity, because the human self was not permitted to misapply the teachings. For those ascended master students who have come out of previous ascended master activities and have seen how departures from the plumb line of truth that started out seemingly innocuous, seemingly almost imperceptibly, but then as those departures were carried to their logical conclusion, the longer you went out in time and application, the further away from the realities of the teachings they went. And so I know that body of students can attest firsthand to the tragic results when the teachings are Aristotled. And that is what happened in those cases. The mighty I Am presence was there. The violet flame was there. The threefold flame was there. Lots of things were there. But first, one thing after another that was part of the original release of Beloved Saint Germain, one thing after another was put aside in the name of new or progressive revelation. And progressively, all the original emphasis and knowledge of the I Am presence was lost. I can recall quite well when we first started welcoming some of those former students. When the question and answer periods came around, people would raise their hands and say, "What's the electronic body? Never heard of the electronic body. What's the universal? The universal sea. Been around for 10, 15 years, never heard of that." The same happened in the first institution of the Theosophical Society, to where in certain whole worldwide splinter groups out of the Theosophical Society, there were disciples who worked in some of the headquarters operations of the libraries and the headquarters administration of different organizations of the Theosophical Society. And we talked with one young lady who'd been serving for 4 or 5 years, and she told us that it was only after 4 or 5 years that she first heard El Moria's name mentioned, and went on a quest to find out who this El Moria was that she'd never heard of before. And that's because, in that case, what happened is we want the teachings of the Mahatmas, but not the Mahatmas themselves. We want to follow these social ideals of universal brotherhood, but El Moria and Kuthumi, their reality is controversial and embarrassing, and so we will keep them in that way under the carpet, as it were, in the secret closet, only for those highest ones to know. It is so typical of human nature that it wishes to constantly misappropriate those things. I'll just give you one other example, and that is the work of Saint Germain as Proclus. You might recall we've explained to you how soon after his service, because of the institutionalization of the Roman Catholic Church under the power of the Roman emperors, wielding that power, not only did they banish all other forms of religion, but eventually even the philosophical schools, such as the schools of Plato, were considered to be anathema, and they were banished outside of the territory of the Roman Empire. They went into areas of the world where the work that we use, called the Elements of Theology from Proclus, was translated into Arabic and eventually brought back into the Western world, not under Proclus's name, but for many centuries it was treated as if it were written by, yes, Aristotle. And it was accepted with wide acclaim because Aristotle, not being a theologian himself, was no threat to the theology of the Catholic Church. The other thing that happened is that there was a student who gathered up all of the philosophy of Plotinus and of Proclus and co-opted it all. He called himself Dionysus, a historical figure associated with St. Paul, and invented, actually, the very word we're talking about. Today he's called pseudo-Dionysus because he wasn't the real Dionysus, although he used that name. And he is the one who coined the term that so many people detest, the word hierarchy. He's the one that came up with that. At any rate, all of the many of the elements of theology, all of the different layers, that's where you get thrones and powers and principalities and archangels and angels. The 9 stratifications of those levels were all Christianized labels put onto the various levels of the hierarchy, the true hierarchy, as it was explained by Proclus in the Elements and in the Theology of Plato and his commentaries on others of the works of Plato. So this pseudo-Dionysus, his writings were embraced wholesale by the Catholic church. Because although they had a belief that Jesus was the one Son of God who paid for their sins, the idea that monotheism could have God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, and still the Christianity could have that and still believe in one God, that was a tough theological and philosophical explanation to give without giving up on what they felt was their overall monotheism. So these writings and others were co-opted wholesale. The names were changed to protect the guilty. And they were basically plagiarized so closely that when Thomas Aquinas or some of the other middle-aged theologians came along, they now had access to coming back out of the Muslim world where these books were not considered to be a threat, where they'd been translated and preserved outside of the Roman Empire, which was controlled by Christianity. They came back in and were retranslated back into Latin out of the original Greek, read in the Latin, and compared with the writings of this Dionysius, who supposedly wrote in the 1st century AD. And lo and behold, they had to admit that they were the pseudo-Dionysius, that really the true author was none other than the pagan Proclus. So again, another example, this case it would be pseudo-Dionysian, the teachings of the Ascended Masters, rather than Aristotelian, the teachings. But it's the same exact thing. The counterfeiting, the copying, the putting on new labels, and laying claim to it as one's own. I have to tell you that knowing the Ascended Masters as we do, we know that even the Ascended Masters don't claim glory for themselves for what comes through them. All of the Ascended Masters pass that glory on back to the presence of God, the One, over and over again. That not only the teaching of that, but the examples of it are just everywhere in the witness of the Ascended Masters. And the same goes for the example we set here in the Temple of the Presence. Our identities are strong enough. We don't need to prop up our sense of self-worth by having anyone believe that everything originated with us ourselves as something out of the whole cloth. And indeed, what the example that is trying to be set here at the Temple of the Presence is to study, to show yourself approved, a workman unto God. Study the truths of cosmic law and hold to those truths. This is absolutely necessary. You need to study. You all need to study, because there are many, your outer minds still have within them big pockets of unknowing, areas about the operation of the reality of God where you simply don't know. There are other areas which are areas of superstition. I'll just give you one example of this very quickly. Energy. Will you all take out a pencil and paper now and write a 2,000-word essay on what is energy? What is energy? Do you know what energy is? Where does energy come from? What really is this energy that's in this light bulb here? What is the energy in an electric motor? Is it some brute, dumb, inanimate accident of mathematics, something that is just a non-entity? Well, if you were grown up in a modern world, there are all kinds of scientific reasons for what energy is. It's something that's taken for granted. And believe it or not, your mind has certain warps as to what energy is or energy isn't. And because you have not yet ironed out the kinks in your grasp of what God, of the idea that there is such a thing as energy with a capital E, and not E equals mc squared, but capital E as in God-energy. There is such a thing as God energy. What is God energy? Where is its fountainhead? Where is its source? What guides it? What is force? What is action as they relate to divinity? Those are things that, so long as there are the 21st century warp, born out of atheism and born out of materialism, born out of merely never having been armed with the divine perspective from the level of the Godhead. Because really and truly, you can't ever make sense of these things looking down from the bottom of the well of the physical world up at whatever is up there. But when you are in the God consciousness and you turn back and look out at the cascading of the worlds in the golden chains down to this physical world, then you can see the concatenation of cause and effect of cosmic law that comes down until it becomes the electricity in the wire. And you understand what that really and truly is. That's just one example. There's an encyclopedia full of such examples. And so these are important areas that initiates need to know. We don't have the time, but I could cite to you a letter, Mahatma letter from Kathumir, where he talks about the study of all of the etheric activities taking place and how those etheric currents and essences and substances are guided and produce infallible results each and every time, because they are known and they have been mastered by the initiate on the path. I'd like to give you one other example of this as it relates to this whole concept, not only of hierarchy, but also of fidelity to the truths when someone who has the office of transmitting those truths has set forth the record that is there. The great law, the cosmic law, is not stingy, but that law is conservative. It does not permit any unnecessary or wasteful use of itself and of its life and energy. In all of the whole universe, there is not to be any wasted energy. It only exists in the outer activity of mankind. This is true not because it would ever be possible for the universe to ever actually be depleted of that energy, but in order that the students on the path might be taught the conservation, the conserving of that mighty energy. So that is a principle of cosmic law. It is indelible, it is incontrovertible. There can be no waste, and it gives you part of the explanation for why the use of power or energy to heal where there is no illumination incurs negative karma in some cases when there's no possibility of illumination. Why using it to protect where there's not an opportunity for unfoldment and illumination might be karma making, because ultimately it amounts to a wholesale waste of God energy. And every jot and tittle must be accounted for. You will have to redeem what has been wasted. So that is an absolute principle. Now, I'd like to just give you one example of it as it relates to the teachings of the Ascended Masters. When beloved Saint Germain wanted to bring forth these teachings on the mighty I Am Presence and on the violet flame and on the Ascended Master God consciousness, it really was a whole new transcendent way of looking at life. It really did kick over the traces, not only of all of the other world religions, but even what had been handed down and gleaned by the unascended adepts through theosophy. And in order to do that work, and in order to do that, Saint Germain expended megatons of energy to do that initially. He didn't just draw his first messenger aside and say, take out your paper and pencil and write down what I say. For example, when he was going to teach him the Ascension, the first time he actually had arranged it so that the messenger Godfrey would actually facilitate the ascension himself through his own God presence. That's how Godfrey first learned of the ascension. Of course, Saint Germain standing right there, putting all that light into Godfrey's aura and orchestrating the whole drama of that event was all orchestrated by beloved Saint Germain. But he taught him the ascension in that way. Now, do you think Godfrey ever doubted the ascension after that point? Do you think he had any question about what the operation of the law was in that regard? And over again, it was experience. It was putting the experiences there, and that required megatons of power to be expended. And it was a grant, a dispensation from the Lords of Karma as an opportunity, and really it was intended as a worldwide opportunity. And on it goes with different aspects of the principles of the law. They were demonstrated in the first person. They were lived through in such an indelible way because they were so revolutionary. In the first volume, Saint Godfrey actually says that after a few of these first experiences, he had to go back to his lodgings and he had to process what he'd just been through, because there was a tendency, what he'd experienced was so radically flying in the face of his whole life up to that moment and what the world believed, that he had to take his whole worldview apart and put it back together in an entirely new vantage point, even for himself, even though he'd lived through those experiences. Had he not had all of the necessary moral fiber and courage and an attunement with his own God presence, he may well have gone the way of other failures, of others who have been given initiation or an opportunity, but have failed to sustain that through whatever the vicissitudes might have come along. So if you knew, if you had any conception of the magnitude of the light that was expended to bring forth the concept of God individualized, of the violet transmuting flame, of the elixir of life, of the raising of the flesh, physical and etheric double bodies into the resurrection, into the Christ presence, and then on into the iron presence. That is an initiation to the whole planetary body. And the idea that when that mission was completed with Godfrey, and the Brotherhood was obliged to start another Ascended Master activity, the idea that they should take someone who was not a part of that, and once again take the same magnitude of cosmic energy, take them from ground zero and put them through all of this again, that would have been, in one real way, a waste of cosmic energy. Because the record had been etched, the teaching had been set forth. And the masters, the Brotherhood, expects that that will be utilized. That's why it was brought forth, so that it could be drawn upon and utilized. And utilized with a fidelity to that which was given and passed on from one generation to the next. Perhaps built upon, yes, but utilized as it was. So it is ridiculous for anyone to think that the Ascended Masters should have to repeat themselves with each and every individual student, putting them through all the experiences that they gave to Godfrey or they've given to us, just so that everyone would have those things firsthand. That is the value of truth and the principles of cosmic law laid down. This stress on the fidelity to that, then, must be built upon and built upon for there to be a worldwide golden age. And here we come back again to Acropolis Sophia, Acropolis Pavilion, to Operation Pharos, to the Pharos of Hierarchy. Because the same brotherhood that started that first activity, that same hierarchy that started that activity, has sponsored this activity. And it belongs to the Ascended Masters. And is for them to direct, to do with as they will. And the opportunity for any life stream, any torchbearer, to put their hand to the plow, to enter into cooperative world service with the Brotherhood. When you're serving here or you're serving in your home area, you're not serving the representatives or the staff here at headquarters. You are really not even per se serving the masters directly. You are serving the mighty I am presence of all mankind. You're serving God Almighty. You are serving side by side with the Ascended Masters. And your ability to be trusted, your ability to be counted on, when times are hard, to be loyal, to be obedient, to fit yourself into the living, breathing, great pyramid of life that is the hierarchy of light. That's your opportunity, because the brotherhood is in the world. Wherefore to try thee if the temple be not erected. It is a golden opportunity. And those who have that opportunity and then demur, saying thanks but no thanks, because my own personal identity is not being stroked, or I'm not being permitted to serve in the way that I think I should be allowed to. I'm not being permitted the power and the activity that I want. That also is creating a record. And that record will make it harder the next time when the opportunity is presented to integrate with the hierarchy. That's why the path is called a probationary path. You're given the opportunity, and no one prejudges what you'll do, but your actions will say what you do. What you accomplish and the service that you render and your perseverance, all of those things are your auditioning to be welcomed into the hierarchy. And I have to tell you, and I can only allude to this, Godfrey mentioned on more than one occasion what it was like to enter into a physical retreat where the charge of the ascended masters had been sustained for thousands of years. And really and truly, it is like entering into a citadel of light, entering into some turreted castle with a drawbridge and a moat. And when you enter in there and the drawbridge comes up behind you and you're inside there, you feel safe, you feel protected, you feel as if nothing of this whole world can touch you. That's one of the first feelings that comes when you pass certain initiations and you are, the thread of contact as a probationary Chela is afforded you. And you feel that tie to your ascended master sponsors. You begin to feel that you are part of this family of God, where all the aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters know that they are kith and kin of the same parentage, and they all care for one another and all belong to one another. That sense of belonging, that sense of protection, of safety, that sense of being a part of something far greater than yourself, that sense of having a part to play for yourself that just has no end. It will never end. There's no end to playing your role. What a greater joy there could never be. And there are many blessings about the hierarchy and about the brotherhood. Many. The one that I'm permitted to give you a hint about, it's already there before you, but it still is a very important lesson for you to remember. It is there on the shield of Elohim. In that fiat, the light of God never fails, which the Moria's 3 dots mean you say that 3 times. The light of God never fails, the light of God never fails, the light of God never fails, and the mighty I Am presence is that light. When you give that call in full faith in the Brotherhood of Light and the hierarchy of the Ascended Masters, when you give that call, it is like an SOS that goes out across the whole of the Brotherhood. And just that quickly, the Buddhic mind, the one mind of the one God, recognizes what is the perfect answer to ultimately resolve that issue. And whatever part of God or whatever parts of God need in the brotherhood that need to respond, do respond on the instant when that call is given in the proper spirit and faith. And that is a blessing of the overarching protection of the hierarchy of the light. Of course, you have to keep your head about you. If you're panicking, you have to check your emotions at that moment when you think all is lost or there's some crisis looming, or you hear that some loved one in your family has gone to the hospital, or whatever the case might be. Check it all. And right in that moment, give that call. The light of God never fails, and the light of God never fails, and the mighty I am presence is that light. If you want to, you can call to the Master who has never known anything but the light of God never failing, namely mighty victory. He's invited you to say, beloved mighty victory, turn this human situation upside down, inside out, and bring an ascended master miracle of your victory out of it. You can give that call as well on the instant and have that call be answered. So yes, there is no compromising the standards at the Temple of the Presence. We can't. It's impossible. Not if we wish to remain the vanguard, living instrument of the Ascended Masters. We have to conduct ourselves here as if we were inside the Royal Teton Retreat. And that's why the hierarchy of that retreat could radiate here and melt everyone's hearts 2 nights ago. Whichever master, whichever retreat, there are those standards. And no amount of enveigling, no amount of whatever it might be, can ever, no multitudes coming to this platform would ever be worth losing that sponsorship of the Brotherhood and their investment in this activity and in the truths of cosmic law that are intended to go forth throughout the next 2,000 years. That's how the golden age will come about, when everyone embraces those precepts, those golden precepts of the Ascended Master way of life. Well, I'm sorry to say we never did get around to the green ray. Except, I'll leave you with this thought. In the glorious mists of time, the Ascended Masters in their various embodiments take on a wonderful patina of gentility and a certain sense of glory about them, which as Ascended Masters they have. But what I mean to say is that were you to encounter the Hilarion as Iamblichus, the standards of Iamblichus's life, or the standards of Paul, the apostle's life, were you to have known even the messengers Godfrey or Linello, and had to serve night and day with them for days and days on end, you'd come away with this sense that there is a certain code of Ascended Master conduct, code of adherence to the principles of cosmic law in an uncompromising way that might to the outer self seem uncaring, but it is not. It is simply a recognition that the law is the law. And as you love that law and run to embrace it, you will find that it is really not cold and uncaring. It is really not painful to be a part of the brothers and the sense of family belonging that exists in the Brotherhood of Light. Once you divest yourself of those rough edges that chafe under the law that all members of the Brotherhood themselves have embraced for themselves and for all of life. Thank you.